phone. You will be prompted to record your name prior to asking your question. I would now like to turn the call over to your first speaker today, Ms. Cheryl Piasecki. You may begin.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ethics Fundamentals series. I'm Cheryl Piasecki, and I'm joined today by Patrick Shepard. Welcome, Patrick.
Excellent. Thanks, Cheryl. It's good to be here.
And Patrick, can you give everybody a little bit of a taste of what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Today we're going to be talking about Subpart E of the Standards of Conduct. We also know that as 5 C.F.R. 2635-502. And specifically, we're going to be talking about what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do, where it fits within the framework of the Standards of Conduct and the broader ethics laws and regulations, and also give you some tips to apply the regulation so that your program can maybe run more effectively and you can avoid some problems in its application.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, I just wanted to do a very brief reminder to everyone about next week's Advanced Practitioner Series. We're very fortunate to have Stuart Bender, who, as many of you know, is the designated agency ethics official at USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And he's going to be coming over to talk to us about the intersection between the post-employment restrictions and the bar rules, obviously, as those apply to attorneys, government attorneys. So please do join us next week for that session. I think that would be a really good session, and we're always delighted when we have very veteran people in the community come and share their expertise with us.
No, absolutely, and I'm really looking forward to learning about some rules that fall outside of the general scope of what we discuss. We haven't talked about bar rules on one of these programs before, but they're important to keep in mind so we can provide full and complete advice to attorneys who are leaving government.
Absolutely, absolutely. So without further ado, Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Excellent. So it's good to be here. Welcome, everyone. And today what we want to do is we want to talk about Subpart E of the Standards of Conduct, what it does, how it came about, what it's for, and also how we apply it in practice so that we can avoid problems for our programs and our agency operations. So I think one thing that I like to start with, and I think sometimes it's easy to forget, especially when we're talking about appearances and agency discretion, is where do we find the Subpart E? What is that body of regulation called wherein we find it?
It's the Standards of Ethical Conduct for Executive Branch Employees.
And that's really important. We find it in the Standards of Ethical Conduct for Executive Branch Employees. So when we're talking about whose conduct we're regulating here, we're talking about employee conduct.
Yes.
So this is a regulation that applies to employees.
Right.
It creates obligations for employees,
mm-hmm.
And it creates a mechanism for dealing with certain kinds of employee conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And you can contrast this with regulations that set out obligations for agencies. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we're not dealing with here. And it's important to keep in mind because sometimes we think that Subpart E might be putting some constraints upon the ability of agencies to act or make decisions in their own interest.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take a look at the actual text of the regulation. So if you don't have the regulation handy, I'd encourage you to take a look at it because the structure of this rule is a little less than straightforward. I think we could have been a little more artful in our drafting, and I think a lot of the complications we find arise from some complexity in the way the rule is drafted.
Yes, as I'm fond of saying about many of the regulations that we encounter, they're not sterling examples of clarity.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's a little unfortunate because the thing that we're trying to prevent here and the mechanism we're trying to implement is actually relatively straightforward once you understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But getting that from this dense wall of text that we're presented with when we get to 2635-502 is a little bit challenging.
Yes, it's somewhat daunting, I would say. Yes.
It is. And again, when we look at the text of the regulation, we start with the employee. Again, we're talking about the employee standards of conduct. And it says where an employee knows that a particular matter involving specific parties is likely to have a direct and predictable effect on the financial interest of a member of his household.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to stop there. So this is a sort of starting condition. So in those situations where an employee realizes that a particular matter involving specific parties to which he or she has been assigned is likely to have a direct and predictable effect on a member of the household, then something has to happen.
Right.
Right. That's not the end of the analysis. It's
Exactly.
the beginning. And then we could skip over a bunch and see what has to happen in that case. And then it says, we could skip over this next sort of clause, and then it says, and where the employee determines that the circumstances would cause a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts to question his impartiality in the matter.
Mm-hmm.
So we have two criteria here.
Right.
So in this first prong, the first criteria is where we have a specific party matter that would have a direct and predictable effect on the financial interest of a member of the household. It looks like we have some folks are having a little bit of a problem on the Hangout. Let me just respond to them quickly.
Okay.
So it looks like some folks say that are finding that it says this is about to begin, but it hasn't begun yet. If you're having trouble with that, the best thing to do is hit refresh on your browser and the video should come up. It looks like we have 150 folks viewing now, so it looks like most people are able to see that.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so we have kind of these two criteria. So once we've established there's a specific party matter, and then once we've then we have an obligation to consider whether a reasonable person would question our impartiality. So we're really getting a guidepost. And likewise.
No, I was just going to say, and I think what the important thing that Patrick's trying to point out here is that you really have to disaggregate this one very long run-on sentence to realize that there are constituent pieces to it that sort of fit together, and where he stopped you in the first instance and then took you down to where a reasonable person, that's sort of one of two prongs that 502 is addressing.
That's right. I think, if we were going to rewrite this in light of some of the lessons we've learned in teaching this regulation, we would have had this be two sentences.
Absolutely.
So the first sentence would be where a specific party matter would have a direct and predictable effect on the financial interest of a member of the household. You should ask yourself whether a reasonable person would question your impartiality.
Yes.
And then the second sentence would say,
yes,
where a specific party matter involves someone with whom you have a covered relationship, then you should ask yourself whether or not a reasonable person would question your impartiality.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting here. So these are kind of sort of threshold considerations about when we need to ask the impartiality question. But 502 doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the broader construct of the employee standards of conduct. I think another name for the presentation today could be secrets from the preamble.
Secrets from the crypt.
That's
sometimes
right.
The preamble feels that way because it's kind of buried someplace,
And the preamble gives some historical context to sort of what OG was doing here, what came before the standards of conduct, and how agencies were managing things. And we take pains in the preamble to explain that this exists in addition to the principles, the 14 principles that we find in Subpart A. And we often forget that those principles apply in addition to the specific provisions of the standards. And in the preamble, we say that these are some circumstances that we're particularly concerned with. They're not the only circumstances we're concerned with, but we are particularly concerned. So we decided to provide some guidance to employees about what they should do in these circumstances.
Exactly. And I think it's a matter of, again, and we've said this in prior presentations, part of the standards of conduct is to put employees on notice about what type of conduct could result in disciplinary actions to them, so that you give them something of a framework in which to conduct themselves, so where they know, so they have some sensibility about where the lines are.
That's exactly right. So we want to provide enough specificity so that employees are not sort of flying blind when applying the standards, but that doesn't absolve them of the need to continue to consider whether or not they are acting impartially or whether they're creating the appearance that they're violating a law or regulation.
Right.
So I think that's some important context to keep in mind as we go through. So let's take a look at the slides, because I think some pictures can help us kind of unpack this rather complex sentence. So see here we have kind of, these are the two main prongs of 502A represented on the screen. So we have specific party matters where there is a direct and a predictable effect on the financial interest of a member of the household. And then what do we have to do?
And then we have to ask ourselves whether a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts would question our impartiality.
Right. And likewise, whether or not a particular matter involving specific parties involves someone with whom we have a covered relationship. And then we have a covered relationship kind of defined on the screen here. Someone where you're an organization where you're an active participant, a former employer, relative's employer, household member, relative, or person with whom with a financial tie to the filer. And this is another area of interest in the preamble. A number of agencies were concerned with the level of specificity and the granularity of the definition of covered relationship. Some agencies suggested we should add more. Some agencies suggested that we should have clear definitions. Some agencies suggested that we should do away with them altogether. We declined to make any of those changes. And the reason we did that is because, again, in the case of the covered relationship, we're talking about a threshold consideration.
Right.
The presence of a person with whom you have a covered relationship as a party to a specific party matter merely requires the employee to ask him or herself if he or she has an appearance of concern, or if a reasonable person would question their impartiality.
Right.
And we have to consider the totality of the circumstances in that case. So we don't really need to define what a household member is, because we still have to ask the appearance question.
Right, exactly. So again, these are supposed to be triggers for when these are the circumstances where we think it's most likely that a reasonable person would question your impartiality. So we tried to give enough of a sensibility about, again, the triggering events that should require that the employee stop and say, you know, would a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts question my impartiality? But that doesn't, we never in a million years in 502 attempted to define the entire universe of circumstances where an employee should be disqualified or should consider whether or not they should participate in a matter because of an appearance of lack of impartiality.
That's exactly right. So let's just go sort of briefly through the two specific prongs, and then look at we have a picture that'll share with us kind of the structure of the regulation as a whole.
Sure.
So again, we just sort of discussed this. Why are household financial interests important? Well, they're important because where you have a household financial interest that would be affected by the particular matter, we have to ask ourselves whether or not our impartiality would be questioned. It sounds a little bit like the language in 208,
yes.
And to some extent, Subpart E expands upon those requirements, but in some respects, it's quite different. So, you know, I encourage you to sort of keep that in mind as we go through here. Likewise, why are covered relationships important? And again, if someone with whom we have a covered relationship is a party to a matter, we should
ask ourselves whether a reasonable person would question our impartiality.
Exactly. So those are our two threshold considerations, and they give us a hint about where we might find impartiality questions or concerns or appearance issues.
Right.
And again, as you mentioned, they're not the only place where we find those, but there's some that we find to be the most likely scenarios where employees are going to run into impartiality concerns, and also places where agencies are likely to be criticized.
I mean, and if we can stop just for a second and talk a little bit about, like, you know, when you said why the members of the household financial interest piece, and I think it was an attempt to sort of extend the sensibilities of the conflict of interest provisions in 208 to say that, you know, okay, just because one of the imputed relationships under 208 is not necessarily involved, to the extent that your household could ostensibly be in some way affected financially, it gives the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so we wanted to capture those appearance issues that go beyond the scope of 208. And likewise with the personal, the covered relationships, what were we trying to capture there? We were trying to capture business relationships and sort of like personal affiliations that you have outside of government, because aren't those the most likely ones to create the potential for at least an appearance of a conflict or lack of impartiality?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the relationship to the 14 principles here is really important, you know, because I think we're primarily implementing principles 8 and 14. 8 requires us to remain impartial and to not act favorably, you know, improperly favorably to any particular party or outside interest. And principle 14 requires us to avoid the appearance that we're violating any law, regulation, or principle.
Exactly.
So this is a way to help us do that. But it's not the only way. We could have problems with these principles outside of the confines of 502. And indeed, other parts of the standards address some of these issues. Last month, when we were talking about Subpart G, there are some specific parts of Subpart G that refer to these two principles and help us to avoid those kinds of appearance concerns. So this isn't the be-all, end-all when it comes to appearances. It's really just a guidepost for employees to know when an impartiality concern is likely to arise. And that kind of dovetails with the other misconception about 502, which is that it somehow creates restrictions or obligations for agencies to make assignments or not make assignments for employees. And I think this is a place where it's really important to keep in mind the difference between those two areas.
Yeah, because I do think there are a lot of agencies that feel that they are constrained to the expressly articulated provisions of 502, in deciding when someone may or may not participate in a matter. And I think that that's precisely the point you're trying to get to, is what 502 is reaching to what an employee may or may not do. It's not constraining an agency's ability to have authorities to do or not do certain things.
Yeah, so today we were talking about appearances versus agency discretion. And when we're talking about agency discretion, the agencies have the authority and the obligation to make decisions that are in the best interest of the programs and operations of the agency. So if you had an impartiality concern that wasn't specifically addressed in 502, and an agency wanted to take action to mitigate that risk of criticism, OGE is silent on your ability to do that. The standards of conduct neither give nor take away those authorities. Again, we're talking about the obligation for employees. And I say that there's sort of one exception there, which is 502 also creates a process by which agencies can authorize an employee to participate, notwithstanding an appearance concern. And this is very important, because prior to the creation of the standards, there was no such mechanism. So we created this so that agencies could acknowledge that there's an appearance concern, an employee could raise an appearance concern, and notwithstanding that appearance concern, an agency designee could authorize an employee to go ahead and participate. It's not an obligation to authorize, but it's the ability to do so. So we're kind of bowing to agency discretion and authority to make decisions about the efficacy of the service. So here we have a chart which I think kind of helps bring this into focus when we're looking at 502. So on the left, we're talking about covered relationships. So our threshold question is there a particular matter involving specific parties? Then is there a covered relationship? And then is the person with whom the employee has a covered relationship a party to the matter, or are they representing someone who is? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, then we have to determine whether a reasonable person would question the employee's impartiality. So that sounds all very complicated, but really what we have is a guidepost to finding out, with respect to specific party matters, where we might have impartiality concerns. Likewise, in the case of the household financial interest, again, the threshold question is, are we talking about specific party matters? Is the matter likely to have a direct and predictable effect on the household member's financial interest? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then we have to ask the impartiality question. And then we get to 5 CFR 2635 502A2. And what A2 says is, would a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts question the employee's impartiality? And you'll note that there are no threshold considerations. And if we find there's an impartiality concern, we can use the mechanism here to either determine that an employee should be authorized to participate, or to determine that recusal is appropriate. So you can see here why these definitions of covered relationship are important, because they provide a guidepost, but they're not dispositive. They're neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for asking the reasonable person question.
Exactly. So I mean, in essence, what A2 is saying is acknowledging that the covered relationship provisions and the financial interest provisions are not the universe, that there are other circumstances, and even the specific elements that have to be present under those covered relationship and financial interest prongs, e.g. that it's a specific party matter, that there may be circumstances other than those that are expressly articulated in these two prongs, where you should ask yourself whether a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts would question your impartiality, or where a reasonable person might question your impartiality, and the agency should advise that the employee recuse themselves from any such matter. Again, so it's that A2 prong is basically it's tipping its hat to, we've identified the circumstances we think are most likely where we're going to tell you have to ask the reasonable person question, but we're also acknowledging that there are many, many, many other circumstances where it is prudent to ask the reasonable person question and to take whatever steps are necessary.
That's right. And I think it's important to remember this is in addition to the obligations under the 14 principles. Nothing in here allows an employee to act partially. We still have the obligation not to put private interests in front of the public's interest, not to misuse our public office for private gain. And those are all in addition to this mechanism for adjudicating possible impartiality considerations.
Right.
And it's always important to remember that, because some employees say, well, I don't have a covered relationship, so I can do whatever I want. And that's not the way the regulations work together. All of those prohibitions continue to apply. And I think we mentioned this last month, the relationship to Subpart G. Oftentimes, I think our process is to look for a potential financial conflict of interest, and where we don't find one, to go immediately to Subpart E of the standards. And while that's not bad, we still have to remember that the provisions in Subpart E exist in addition to the proscriptions against using public office for private gain in Subpart G and in the 14 principles.
Right.
So while it's okay to go from 208 to 502, we have to go further and consider Subpart G and the 14 principles.
And I think the one point that you made as well, which I think is what we sometimes lose sight of as well, is that the 502 authorization provisions are really very important, because what they are in effect doing is saying, agencies, you aren't crippled by circumstances where you do find these conditions where that might be likely to raise an appearance concern. You're not crippled into inaction. We're going to give you an actual articulated authority to authorize participation, notwithstanding that a reasonable person might question the employee's impartiality in the matter.
Right, and I think the inverse is also true, that there's nothing in Subpart E that restrains agencies from making decisions to promote the efficiency of the service, to promote the integrity of their programs and operations, to avoid the risk of criticism. So that, there are circumstances where agency ethics officials have asked us, could you give the agency the power to require an employee to recuse? And I think what we point out in the preamble is that an employee doesn't have a default right to be assigned to a matter. They must be assigned. And an agency can decline to assign an employee to a matter sort of for any
reason,
for any defensible reason.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing to remember, that the default position is not I can participate unless OGE says I cannot. You don't begin by being assigned to a matter. So if there's a reason not to assign an employee, like an appearance concern or a possibility of criticism, and the agency thinks it's in the agency's interest to assign that employee differently, OGE doesn't prescribe that ability. What we're doing here is creating obligations for the employee in the employee standards of conduct.
Right.
Another thing that we often talk about once we get here in this presentation, when I've given it before, is ethics officials say, well, sometimes there's disagreement between the ethics office and the program office about what the prudential course of action is. And Subpart E provides some authorities to the agency designee for making authorizations and determinations. But beyond the scope of that, where the agency is trying to determine its own interest, that's sort of a management issue where the agency ethics office should have input into that management decision. But again, it's going to be a decision within the agency determine its own interest. NOG is also not in the position to be able to sort of put our thumb on the scales, in favor of the opinion of the ethics official. So it's sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind, right? That we have the agency's ability to make its decisions about who does what work, and then we have some obligations for employees to ask the reasonable person question in these circumstances, and indeed in sort of all circumstances. And that those two exist in concert, but one doesn't cancel the other out.
Right.
So sort of in summary, if we have a covered relationship, we have to ask the reasonable person question. If we have a specific party matter that would affect the household financial interest, we have to ask the reasonable person question. Anything else, we should.
We may have to ask the reasonable person question.
Yes, we may have to ask the reasonable person question, and indeed we should. We should always be endeavoring to avoid the appearance of a potential conflict of interest. So here's just to sort of juxtapose 208 and 502. And again, this is to keep in mind the context. We often start by looking for financial conflicts of interest, where there isn't a proscription for 18 U.S.C. Section 208. We often go to 502, and indeed we should, to determine if we have an appearance concern. But we also want to remember Subpart G. If you're not familiar with the provisions of Subpart G, we have a recorded distance learning event from last month that can walk you through some of those. And we also want to keep in mind the broader context of all of the standards and all of the laws and regulations, so that we don't forget any. Well, we said this is going to be about half an hour, and it's been about half an hour. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we can open it up for questions. If you have a question on the Hangout, you can use the Hangout question app in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And Lori, if we could open up the phone lines for questions, please.
Sure, thank you. At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. You'll be prompted to record your name prior to asking your question. To withdraw your question, you can press star 2. Again, to ask a question, that's star 1 on your touch-tone phone. One moment, please.
While we're waiting for questions, you know, it is interesting with 502 because I do think this is one of the provisions of the standards that causes some of the greatest consternation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, part of it is the drafting is a little complex and maybe a bit inartful. But then even once you get past that, we're admittedly kind of in a gray area. These are places where neat and tidy black and white lines don't serve us. We can't anticipate every possible appearance concern. So we do our best to sort of gesture at, or, you know, suggest where we're likely to find these concerns. But what we don't want to do is suggest that just because these are the ones we've identified as most likely, that they're the only ones.
Right.
And that's the challenge we were grappling with when drafting this regulation. And it's something to keep in mind as you apply the regulation, that, you know, this is where we think they're most likely or most common to find appearance concerns, but they're not the only ones. And we want to always be mindful of the possibility, the risk of being criticized, or the risk of you know, appearing partial. Also might be good
We do have a question.
Okay.
Excellent.
We do have a question from the phone. Jennifer Howman, your line is open.
Thank you. Hi, Cheryl and Patrick.
Hi.
Hi, Jennifer. Welcome.
One thing I just wanted to ask was, so it would be incorrect, though, to cite 502A2 if it's not a particular matter, correct? You would just have to use the principles?
Cite in connection with like a piece of advice you were giving?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could, I mean, it might be better to cite to the general principles, because that's really what you're invoking. You're invoking that you think there's, you know, that there's an appearance of lack of impartiality, or an appearance of a conflict of interest. And that would fit solidly within the general principles.
And I think there's another point to be made here, which is that, you know, we're talking about the employee standards of conduct, and 502A2 creates the possibility of an employee identifying for him or herself other circumstances where an appearance concern is likely. Once that's happened, at the time that you're providing the advice, you know, I think that the principles would be appropriate, but you could also note that the issue arose under 502A2. Does that answer your question, Jennifer? So maybe the answer is
Sounds good.
yes and yes.
Yes and yes, both maybe, perhaps.
Yes.
Great, thank you. And I'm not showing any questions.
Thank you. At this time, I'm showing no further questions.
Well, one of the things that we had said in last month's presentation, misuse of position, and you and I were actually talking about this before the broadcast today too, is again that we've seen in both in court cases as well as in MSPB adjudications, where the charges that are brought against the employee in, you know, disciplinary or other actions are referring to general principles. They're referring to the appearance of having violated the law or regulation, or the appearance of using public office for private gain, or of using public office for private gain. And it's a citation to the principles that we see, you know, very often.
And I think we've seen in some recent presentations, in the spring, we had a presentation on essentials of ethics enforcement, where that seems to be a more common practice in charge drafting when taking disciplinary actions against employees, to cite to the principles, or cite to you know, sort of adverse effects on the efficiency of the service. So, you know, from an enforcement perspective, that's the way those folks are approaching things. So I think from an advice perspective, you know, we should feel comfortable, you know, referring to the principles.
Well, I think one other thing, and I just want to fit this in here. I know we're running up against our half an hour here, but one other thing I want to pose is that one of the things that OGE sort of struggled with, and I think we all struggle with, is when we're getting into the appearance concerns. I mean, appearance is in the eye of the beholder. It's one of the most subjective areas of the regulation and regulatory scheme that we have to deal with. And so it invariably requires a certain degree of exercise of judgment. So I think that was another thing that was motivating 502, was that you know, different people see appearances differently, and different people have different sensibilities about what is or isn't, you know, involved an appearance of impartiality, or lack of impartiality. And so I guess the sort of the cautionary tale here, though, is that, you know, we also want to be careful about not being too overly zealous and not having a good, you know, defense for a position that we're taking if we're resting it on one of the 14 principles, to make sure that we're being consistent in the way that we're applying that, that we ourselves understand what our own sort of sensibilities are about what considerations we take into account when we're going to invoke one of the principles.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's also important to remember that Subpart E is meant as a prophylactic measure.
Yes.
Right. This is a forward-looking measure to help employees know when they need to seek remedial action, either through recusal or authorization.
Mm-hmm.
So we're focused on sort of forward-looking here.
Right.
Where we have concerns that an employee indeed is acting partially or using public office for private gain,
Mm-hmm.
we should look to Subpart G,
Mm-hmm.
sort of, or Principle 8 in
Right.
particular, but probably both.
Right.
We have another question, which is a kind of good question, which is where is the definition of particular matter involving specific parties as used in 502? 2637, I think is what they meant, has been rescinded.
Mm-hmm.
The definition at 2640 is probably the most recent one that we want.
2641 actually might be more recent than 2640.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The post-employment regulations at 5 CFR Part 2641, they're the regulations that implement the post-employment restrictions, have an operational definition of particular matter involving specific parties. And that's sort of the 2637 was the prior post-employment implementing regulation. So 2641 is the closest analog to 2637.
Yeah, and that's probably a good tip overall.
Yeah.
And if you're not familiar with 2641, we recently did a massive open online course on the post-employment reg, and we walk you through it and give you some hints to the structure. And that's a long regulation. So if you're struggling with it, I'd encourage you to take a look at that presentation. But thank you for the question. And, do we have any other questions on the phone, Maury?
I'm showing no questions at this time.
Okay, and I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout.
Okay, well, Patrick, thanks so much for the session this afternoon. I think it's a difficult session, and we like to revisit the impartiality provisions with you all periodically. And every time we do a summit, we have multiple presentations on this, because we realize this is an area that causes people people struggle with.
No, I think it's a very difficult sort of area, because it's not clear. It doesn't have bright lines. And if you're looking for a more structural presentation on this topic, in the course of our virtual summit last year about this time, we did 2 sessions walking through the elements and the definitions that provide some sort of more granular guidance. We also have a course from about 2 years ago that's also on the YouTube channel and Google Plus pages, that's sort of a longer introduction to the entire impartiality process. But today we wanted to take the kind of narrow question and deal with some of the misapprehensions that people have about the rule.
So do take advantage of the resources that we have for you online on our YouTube page and on the max.gov page. But I think that does it for us for today, Patrick.
Excellent.
Please join us next week for Stuart Bender and his presentation on the post-employment rules as they intersect with the bar rules. And I'm Cheryl Kane-Piasecki, and I thank you very much for your time today. Have a good afternoon.